Morning coffee in my garden was supposed to be peaceful. That was before Karen's silhouette flashed across my stone path like she owned it. When I questioned her unauthorized jogging route through my private property, her response made me choke on my coffee. "Your path is prettier and better for my knees," as if that justified trespassing. To Karen, the queen of our neighborhood and self-appointed HOA tyrant, permission was an outdated concept. The look in her eyes told me she wasn't planning to stop. Little did she know, this morning marked the beginning of a war she wasn't prepared to fight. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thinks your property is community space? Drop a like if you've been there. I'm not unreasonable. In fact, neighbors often comment on how I keep to myself. My Tudor-style home sits at the end of Maple Avenue, with a garden I've spent 7 years perfecting. The stone pathway winding through beds of carefully cultivated perennials isn't just decorative. It's my sanctuary, the place I decompress after long days running my architectural consulting firm. The pathway cost me nearly $8,000 to install, with each stone hand-selected and placed to create a natural flow. It wasn't meant for running shoes or daily traffic. It was meant for contemplation, for slow walks with a mug of coffee at dawn. Karen Wilkins moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago and immediately appointed herself queen. Within a month, she'd secured a position on the Homeowners Association board. Within 3, she was president. I tried to stay neutral when neighbors complained about her increasingly outlandish violations notices. $150 fine for garbage cans left out 4 hours too long, $200 for grass half an inch too tall. I never thought I'd be in her crosshairs. I'm meticulous about following rules. But Karen didn't care about rules unless they benefited her, and apparently her orthopedist had recommended softer surfaces for her morning jogs. "The stone has more give than concrete," she explained that first morning, not slowing her pace. "It's perfect for my knee condition." "But this is my private property," I emphasized, gesturing to the clear boundaries between my land and the public sidewalk. Karen's laugh was dismissive. "Don't be so territorial, James. We're a community here." She adjusted her designer headband. "Besides, as HOA president, I have right-of-ways for community inspections." I checked the HOA guidelines that afternoon. No such right existed. But challenging Karen directly would only make things worse. My neighbor John confirmed this when I mentioned the incident over our shared fence that evening. "She's been running through your garden?" John's eyebrows shot up. Classic Karen, she's been reporting my bird feeder as an unauthorized wildlife feeding station for months. John Harrison, retired lawyer and passionate bird enthusiast, had become my closest ally in the neighborhood. His Victorian home adjacent to mine contained a bird sanctuary that Karen considered unsightly. "She's abusing her position," I said, watching a cardinal land on John's feeder. "Absolutely," John agreed. "But be careful how you handle this. Karen doesn't just hold grudges, she nurtures them like prize-winning roses." The next morning, Karen appeared again, this time with a friend in tow. They chatted loudly about the public garden path as they jogged through my property, crushing some newly planted impatiens. I stepped outside. "Excuse me, but you're damaging my flowers." Karen's friend looked startled, but Karen merely waved a dismissive hand. "We pay HOA dues for neighborhood beautification. Consider this community appreciation of your landscaping." "My garden isn't covered by HOA jurisdiction," I stated firmly, "and you know it." Her smile tightened. "Actually, James, all exterior home elements visible from the street fall under HOA purview. Section 8, paragraph 3 of the covenant." "My backyard garden isn't visible from the street," I countered. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Technicalities. I'm sure we could find several violations if we looked closely enough. That shed of yours might not be regulation height." The threat was clear: back off, or face the wrath of arbitrary HOA penalties. For a week I watched as Karen's morning jogs became a neighborhood event. Sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, always without permission. I documented each trespass with my security cameras, which she either didn't notice or didn't care about. My garden path began showing signs of wear. A loose stone here, a trampled flower there. Larry, Karen's husband, stopped by one Saturday with a bottle of wine, a peace offering. Unlike his domineering wife, Larry was soft-spoken and perpetually apologetic. "I've tried talking to her," he confided, looking over his shoulder as if she might materialize at any moment. "Karen just feels that your garden is too beautiful to be private." "That's not how property rights work, Larry," he sighed. "I know, but once Karen decides something is for the greater good of the community, she doesn't back down." He lowered his voice. "Between us, I think she's jealous. Our backyard is all concrete patio. She's been after me to put in a garden path for years, but I'm not exactly handy." The conversation gave me a crucial insight. Karen wasn't just being entitled. She was coveting what she couldn't have. And in her world, if she wanted something, she'd find a way to take it. The final straw came when I returned from a business trip to find evidence that someone had been in my garden while I was gone. Not just running through, but sitting, cigarette butts near my bench, an empty seltzer can in the bird bath. The security footage confirmed my suspicions. Karen had hosted a small garden committee meeting in my absence. John was outraged when I showed him the footage. "That's straight-up trespassing. You could call the police." "And make her martyrize herself as the victim of an unreasonable neighbor?" I shook my head. She'd spin it. I need to be smarter. That night, reviewing the HOA regulations I'd previously ignored, I discovered something interesting. Any substantial changes to visible landscaping required HOA approval, but there was no clause preventing protective measures for existing gardens. And more importantly, once the HOA approved something, it was notoriously difficult to revoke that approval without substantial cause. "You know," John said when I shared my discovery, "if you can't beat them at their own game, change the rules entirely." A plan began forming in my mind, one that would use Karen's beloved HOA regulations against her. I would give her an appropriate path for her morning jogs and teach her a lesson about respecting boundaries in the process. "I think I'm about to develop a sudden passion for rose gardening," I told John with a smile. "The thornier varieties, of course." The HOA meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening at the community center. A beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs and Karen's gavel, which she used liberally to silence any opposition. I arrived early, proposal in hand, and took a seat in the front row. Karen's eyebrows rose when she saw me. In 3 years, I'd never attended a meeting. "James, what a surprise," she said, arranging her papers on the table. "Here to discuss the shed height violation?" "No violation exists," I replied pleasantly. "I'm here to submit a landscaping proposal." Her smile faltered. "Oh?" "Well, proposals are typically submitted 2 weeks in advance for committee review." "Actually," I slid the folder across the table, Section 12, Paragraph 5, states that homeowners may present landscaping proposals at any general meeting, provided they bring sufficient documentation for immediate review. Karen's mouth tightened. I'd studied the regulations thoroughly, knowing she couldn't dismiss me without appearing obviously biased. "Very well," she said, accepting the folder with obvious reluctance. "We'll add it to tonight's agenda." As other board members arrived, I nodded politely to each. Most were Karen's allies, neighbors cowed into submission by her relentless enforcement. Only Martha Chen, a retired botanist, seemed genuinely pleased to see me. She'd always admired my garden from afar. When the meeting officially began, Karen sped through agenda items with remarkable efficiency, clearly hoping to minimize my speaking time, but eventually she could delay no longer. "Next item, James Wilson's landscaping proposal," she gestured for me to present. I approached the front with confidence. "Thank you, Madam President. As many of you know, I've invested considerable time and resources into creating a garden that enhances our neighborhood's aesthetic appeal." Several members nodded. My garden had won the Community Beautification Award twice, before Karen rigged the voting system. "Recently, I've been inspired to add a protective border of roses around my garden path," I continued, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation I'd prepared. "These heritage climbing roses will add visual interest while preserving the integrity of the stone walkway." Images of beautiful rose archways appeared on screen. What I didn't emphasize was the variety I'd selected. Rosa rugosa, Hansa known for its exceptionally thorny stems and aggressive growth habit. The plantings will be set back the required 3 feet from property lines and won't exceed height restrictions, I continued. As you can see from the documentation, this change is fully compliant with all HOA regulations. Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. While roses are certainly pretty, they require significant maintenance. What happens when the thorns become a safety hazard? I'd anticipated this objection. Excellent question, Madam President. That's why I've included a detailed maintenance schedule, and I've already contracted with Green Thumb Landscaping for weekly pruning. Martha Chen leaned forward. The variety you've selected is actually quite disease-resistant and well-suited to our climate. I see no horticultural objections. Karen's eyes narrowed. What about foot traffic? These thorny barriers could impede community access. There is no community access through private backyards, John interjected from the audience. Unless the HOA has secretly changed property laws. A murmur of laughter rippled through the attendees. Karen's cheeks flushed. The point is, I continued smoothly, these roses will enhance neighborhood beautification while protecting existing landscaping investments. The HOA charter specifically encourages both objectives. Karen whispered urgently with Larry, who shook his head helplessly. She was searching for a procedural technicality to block my proposal, but I'd been meticulous. We'll need to put this to a vote, she finally declared. To Karen's visible dismay, the proposal passed 4-3. Martha's enthusiasm for proper horticulture had swayed 2 board members, who typically voted with Karen. The roses had official HOA approval. Don't think this is over, Karen muttered as I gathered my materials after the meeting. Roses can die so easily in the wrong conditions. I smiled pleasantly. That sounds dangerously like a threat, Madam President. Perhaps I should install security cameras to protect the HOA-approved landscaping? Her eyes widened. She hadn't known about my existing cameras. The following weekend, the rose planting began. I hired professionals to ensure the work met every specification in my approved proposal. The roses would form a stunning and impenetrable barrier around my stone path. Within weeks, the thorny stems would create a natural deterrent to Karen's morning jogs. John watched the installation from his patio, glass of iced tea in hand. This is the most elegant middle finger I've ever seen, he chuckled. Perfectly legal, Thorny revenge. It's not revenge, I corrected him. It's boundary enforcement. For 3 days, Karen drove past my house repeatedly, watching the rose installation with thinly veiled fury. On the 4th day, I received an official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. Unauthorized garden shed exceeds height restrictions by 3 inches. Fine, $350. I measured the shed immediately. It was exactly at the height limit. This was Karen's retaliation, manufacturing violations where none existed. I appealed the violation through the proper channels, submitting photographic evidence and measurements. My appeal forced a special review session where Karen had to recuse herself due to our ongoing landscaping dispute. Without her influence, the violation was dismissed. But Karen wasn't finished. 2 days later, another notice appeared. Excessive water runoff from property. Fine, $275. Again, I appealed with documentation from a licensed plumber, confirming my drainage was proper and code compliant. Again, the violation was dismissed. She's getting desperate, John observed when I showed him the latest notice. But be careful, cornered animals are the most dangerous. He was right to warn me. The following morning, I awoke to the sound of voices in my garden. Through the window, I saw Karen leading a small group, the Garden Safety Committee, according to their matching visors, inspecting my newly planted roses. I hurried outside. Excuse me, this is private property. Karen smiled thinly. We're conducting an emergency safety inspection. Concerns have been raised about these plants being a potential neighborhood hazard. Any safety concerns should have been addressed before the HOA approved the installation, I pointed out, and inspections require 48 hours written notice. Unless there's an urgent safety matter, Karen countered, Mrs. Peterson's grandchild could be injured by these thorns. Mrs. Peterson, a committee member who lived 6 houses away, nodded vigorously. Her grandchildren visited twice a year. My garden is fully fenced, I said. Unless someone is trespassing, there's no safety issue. Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. We'll include your objection in our report. After they left, I checked the security footage. Karen had been gesturing animatedly toward sections of the newly planted roses, particularly near the garden access points. Her intentions were clear. She was building a case to force removal of the roses. That evening, I received a certified letter from the law offices of Bentley and Smythe, claiming to represent the HOA. It stated that an emergency safety review had found my rose installation to be substantially different from the approved proposal, creating an imminent threat to community welfare. I was ordered to remove the plants within 48 hours or face legal action. I immediately called John. "This is absurd," he said after reviewing the letter. "First, the HOA's actual attorney is Patterson and Associates. This Bentley and Smythe is probably Karen's cousin who just passed the bar. Second, there's no such thing as an emergency safety review in the HOA bylaws." "So it's a bluff?" I asked. "A poorly executed one," John confirmed. "But it shows she's escalating. Document everything." I didn't need to wait long for Karen's next move. The following night, my security cameras captured movement in the garden at 2:17 a.m. The footage showed a hooded figure moving along the rose beds, spraying something from a garden applicator. By morning, several sections of newly planted roses were withering, their leaves discolored. "Chemical damage," the landscaper confirmed after inspection. "Someone applied a concentrated herbicide." He pointed to a drip pattern consistent with the security footage. I filed a police report submitting the video evidence. While the hooded figure's face wasn't clearly visible, the physical build and distinctive designer running shoes matched Karen's exactly. The police officer who took the report seemed reluctant to get involved. "Neighborhood disputes are tricky," he explained. "Without a clear facial identification, it's hard to prove who did this." "What about trespassing and property damage?" I pressed. "You could pursue it, but without conclusive identification," he shrugged. "Maybe talk to your HOA, they usually handle neighborhood issues." The irony wasn't lost on me. Reporting Karen to the organization she controlled would be pointless. I replaced the damaged roses the next day, adding additional security cameras with improved night vision capabilities. This time I included small, discreet warning signs. "Property under 24-hour video surveillance." Karen's morning jogs abruptly stopped. Instead, she began a whisper campaign, telling neighbors that my aggressive thorny barrier was a passive-aggressive attack on community cohesion. Some neighbors believed her, others recognized the hypocrisy. The neighborhood began to divide into factions, Team Karen versus Team Common Sense, as John called it. HOA meetings became increasingly tense, with Karen struggling to maintain her authoritarian control as more homeowners questioned her interpretations of the regulations. Martha Chen became an unexpected ally, using her botanical expertise to defend my rose installation at every opportunity. "These plants are perfectly appropriate and enhancing our biodiversity," she declared at one particularly heated meeting. Karen's frustration grew visible with each passing week. Her immaculate appearance began to slip. Hairless, perfectly coiffé, designer outfits replaced by more casual attire. According to neighborhood gossip, she'd been forced to recuse herself from so many conflict of interest votes that her power was waning. And then, approximately 3 weeks after the nighttime herbicide incident, I received another certified letter. This one was from the actual HOA attorney, Patterson and Associates. It informed me that an emergency board meeting had been called to address ongoing neighborhood disputes and leadership concerns. John called moments after I opened it. "Did you get it? This is big, James. They only call emergency meetings for serious issues, like the HOA president potentially vandalizing private property," I suggested. "Exactly." Word is that Martha showed the board your security footage. Some of them are worried about legal liability if they don't address it. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following evening. I arrived to find the community center packed, nearly every homeowner in attendance, a rare occurrence for typically dull HOA proceedings. Karen sat at the board table, face rigid, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The HOA vice president, Michael Donovan, called the meeting to order instead of Karen. Due to conflict of interest concerns, President Wilkins has temporarily ceded control of this meeting, he announced. A legal representative from Patterson & Associates explained that the board had become aware of serious allegations regarding conduct unbecoming of HOA leadership and would be reviewing evidence in closed session. The homeowners were asked to wait while the board deliberated. For nearly an hour, we sat in uncomfortable silence. Occasionally, raised voices could be heard from behind the closed door. Larry Wilkins paced the hallway, looking increasingly distressed. Finally, the board emerged. Karen's face was ashen. Michael addressed the room. After the careful consideration of evidence presented, the board has reached a decision regarding recent community disputes. The board finds that there has been an abuse of power and potential criminal activity that cannot be ignored. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen stared straight ahead, knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Effective immediately, Karen Wilkins is removed from her position as HOA president, pending further investigation of property damage allegations. Michael continued. Additionally, all recent violation notices issued by former President Wilkins will be reviewed for validity. Larry hurried to Karen's side as she stood shakily. "This is a witch hunt," she announced to the room, voice cracking. "I've done nothing but try to maintain community standards. If protecting neighborhood values makes me a villain, so be it." She stormed out, Larry trailing behind her with mumbled apologies. In the aftermath, Martha Chen approached me with a smile. "Your roses are blooming beautifully," she said. "Perhaps we should establish a genuine garden committee, one that appreciates boundaries." The following morning, for the first time in weeks, I enjoyed my coffee in peace on my garden bench. The roses were indeed beginning to bloom, adding splashes of deep pink among the thorny protection they provided. John leaned over the fence. "Have you heard? The Wilkins house just went on the market. Karen's decided our neighborhood doesn't meet her standards anymore." I couldn't help but smile. What a shame. "A tragedy," John agreed with obvious insincerity. "By the way, Martha's organizing a neighborhood barbecue next weekend. First one in years without Karen's approved food list and noise restriction enforcement." As John walked away, I noticed a figure standing hesitantly at the garden gate. It was Larry, looking uncomfortable without Karen at his side. "She's gone to stay with her sister," he explained without preamble. I wanted to apologize. Things got out of hand." I gestured to the bench beside me. "Coffee?" Larry looked surprised by the offer but accepted gratefully. "I never wanted any of this. The politics, the fighting. Karen just gets so fixated on being right. Some people need control," I observed, pouring him a cup. "Too much control," Larry sighed. "You know what's ironic? She could have just asked permission to use your path. Most people would say yes if asked respectfully." "Probably," I agreed, "but then she wouldn't have been in charge." Larry nodded sadly. "I'm sorry about your roses, the ones you know." "They'll grow back stronger," I said. "That's the thing about setting boundaries. Once they're established, they tend to thrive." We sat in companionable silence, watching a hummingbird dart among the newly blooming roses. Beyond the thorny barrier, the stone path wound peacefully through my garden, undisturbed by unauthorized footsteps. The path to victory, it turned out, had been paved with roses. The summer heat intensified both the blooming roses and neighborhood tensions. Now in full growth, my rose barrier had become a spectacular display that attracted admiration from passing neighbors and the occasional garden enthusiast with a camera. To everyone except Karen, it represented a horticultural achievement. To her, it was a daily reminder of her waning influence. 2 weeks after the emergency meeting, the neighborhood had settled into an uneasy peace. Karen had not returned from her sister's house, and Larry maintained a low profile, politely waving but rarely engaging in conversation. The for sale sign on their lawn remained, though no open houses had been scheduled. Martha Chen had been appointed interim HOA president, bringing a refreshing focus on community building rather than punitive enforcement. The transformation was remarkable. Neighbors speaking to each other again, children playing outdoors without fear of noise violation notices, and an atmosphere of collective relief. I should have known the calm wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble came via certified mail, not from the HOA this time, but from the County Superior Court. I had been named in a civil lawsuit filed by Karen Wilkins, alleging intentional infliction of emotional distress, targeted harassment via hostile landscaping, and interference with HOA operations resulting in loss of position and reputation. The complaint demanded $250,000 in damages, plus removal of all rose plantings. John was apoplectic when I showed him the court documents. "This is absolutely frivolous. She's the one who trespassed and vandalized your property. The security footage proves it." I remained calm. Karen's desperate. She's lost her power base and needs to save face. We consulted with Amanda Peterson, a litigation attorney John knew from his pre-retirement days. She reviewed the case with professional detachment. "It's a weak case, but that doesn't mean it can't cause you headaches. Courts are reluctant to dismiss these neighborhood disputes outright. Judges often hope the parties will come to their senses and settle." "I'm not settling," I stated firmly. "I did nothing wrong." Amanda nodded. "Then we counterclaim for the property damage, trespassing, and harassment you've endured. But understand that Karen seems unhinged enough to take this all the way to trial, which means expense and stress for you. Even if you ultimately win." The litigation process moved slowly with preliminary motions and procedural filings. Karen rejected an initial mediation attempt, her attorney stating that the plaintiff seeks full vindication, not compromise. Throughout this period, Karen launched what John called Operation Neighborhood Poison, a systematic campaign to turn residents against me. She created a private social media group called Community Safety Concerns, where she posted doctored photos of my rose barrier with claims that neighborhood children had been injured by thorns. The allegations were patently false, but mud tends to stick. Some neighbors began avoiding eye contact, others whispered as I passed. Then came the escalation I hadn't anticipated. One evening I returned home to find 2 county officials and a police officer standing at my front door. They presented a temporary emergency abatement order, a legal document requiring immediate removal of the rose barriers due to imminent public safety hazards. "This order comes directly from the county commissioner's office," the official explained with obvious discomfort. "We rarely issue these, but the medical documentation was compelling." "What medical documentation?" I asked, bewildered. They showed me hospital records, not just for one child, but for 5 different neighborhood children allegedly injured by my roses. The paperwork looked official, complete with doctor signatures and hospital letterheads. "These are fabricated," I insisted. "I know most of these families. No one has been injured." The officer looked sympathetic but firm. "Sir, we have to enforce the order as written. You have 48 hours to remove the plants before the county does it forcibly at your expense." After they left, I immediately called John, who arrived within minutes, followed shortly by Martha. When I explained the situation, Martha was stunned. "This is unprecedented," she said. "Emergency abatement orders require substantial evidence and multiple official approvals." "Karen must have connections at the county level," John theorized. "Or she's falsified more than just the medical records." A quick online search confirmed our suspicions. Karen's sister was the executive assistant to the county commissioner. The family connection had given Karen a backdoor to bypass normal verification procedures. "We need to contact these families immediately," I said. "If the children weren't actually injured, we need them to confirm it before the roses are destroyed." Martha pulled up the neighborhood directory and we began making calls. The first 3 families were shocked to hear their children had supposedly been injured. Their kids hadn't been anywhere near my property in months. One mother, particularly outraged, was a nurse at Mercy Hospital. "I can tell you with absolute certainty that these aren't legitimate records," she said. "The attending physician listed for my son's treatment retired 2 years ago." Armed with statements from the families, John contacted his attorney friend, who filed for an emergency injunction against the abatement order. The judge, troubled by the allegations of falsified medical records, granted a temporary stay. But Karen had anticipated this move. The next morning, a news van parked outside my house. A reporter thrust a microphone toward me as I stepped outside. "Mr. Wilson, how do you respond to allegations that your controversial rose barrier has injured multiple neighborhood children, and that you're fighting a county safety order to protect your landscaping over children's safety?" The ambush interview aired on the evening news, carefully edited to make me appear defensive and callous. The story featured tearful interviews with concerned parents, none of whom I recognized from our neighborhood. One woman claimed her daughter had needed plastic surgery after falling into my hostile vegetation barrier. The camera panned dramatically across my roses, zooming in on thorns while ominous music played. By nightfall, my phone was ringing incessantly with calls from reporters, my email filled with messages from outraged strangers. Someone threw eggs at my front door and a crude sign appeared on my lawn, "Child Hurter." "This is a coordinated attack," Amanda confirmed during an emergency meeting with John and Martha in my kitchen. "Karen is pulling every string she can reach to force you to remove those roses before the truth about her fabrications catches up to her." "But why go to these extremes?" Martha wondered. "It's just landscaping." "It's not about the roses anymore," I realize. "It's about winning." Karen can't accept defeat. If she can't control the neighborhood through the HOA, she'll use any means necessary to reassert her authority. Amanda nodded grimly. "She's likely hoping you'll cave under the public pressure before the legal process can clear you. And it might work. Even with an injunction against the abatement order, the court of public opinion is turning against you." "Then we need to shift the narrative," John said decisively. "Fight fire with fire." His solution was both simple and brilliant. Call a community meeting. Not an HOA meeting, but an open forum for all neighborhood residents in the community center. No officials, no media, just neighbors talking to neighbors. The evening of the meeting, I was shocked by the attendance. Nearly every household was represented, including families I hadn't spoken with in years. The atmosphere was tense, with clear divisions in the room. Those who believed Karen's allegations and those who were skeptical. Martha opened the meeting with calm authority. "We're here to address concerns about James Wilson's rose barrier and the recent claims of injuries. Before anyone speaks, I want to establish one ground rule. First-hand knowledge only. No rumors, no, 'I heard from someone who heard.' Only what you have personally witnessed or experienced." One by one, neighbors stood to speak. No one, not a single resident, had witnessed any injuries, had children who were injured, or knew directly of anyone injured by my roses. Several parents expressed confusion about being named in county documents they'd never seen regarding injuries their children never sustained. Then came the surprise that changed everything. Larry Wilkins entered the community center. The room fell silent as Karen's husband walked slowly to the front, looking more determined than I'd ever seen him. "I need to say something," he began, voice shaking slightly. "The medical records are fake. The parents in the news report are actors. The whole campaign against James and his roses is fabricated." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Karen became obsessed with defeating James after losing her HOA position. He hesitated, then continued. "She had me help create the false documents using her sister's access to county letterhead and my Photoshop skills. She hired a PR firm to coordinate the media attack. She's been planning this for months." Larry placed a USB drive on the table. This contains all the original files, the correspondence with the actors, everything. I can't be part of this anymore. What she's doing isn't just wrong, it's criminal." The silence that followed was deafening. Larry looked directly at me. "I'm sorry, James. I should have stopped this long ago." What happened next was unexpected. Dr. Helen Miller, mother of Ethan, who was supposedly the first child injured, stood up. "I've already reported the falsified hospital records to the medical board and law enforcement. What I didn't know until now was who created them." "Mr. Wilkins, are you willing to make a formal statement to the police?" Larry nodded. "Yes. It's time this ended." Within 24 hours, the county abatement order was permanently rescinded. The news station issued a retraction and apology after learning their concerned parents were paid actors. Karen's sister was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into the misuse of county resources. And Karen herself? She was facing potential criminal charges for document forgery, filing false reports, and obstruction of justice. Her carefully orchestrated campaign had collapsed spectacularly, not because of my efforts, but because her closest ally had finally found the courage to stand up to her. The most stunning revelation came 3 days later when Larry requested to meet with me privately. Over coffee in my garden, ironically seated near the roses that had started it all, he revealed the truth behind Karen's obsession. "She wasn't jogging through your garden just because it was convenient," he confessed. "She was scouting it. We had plans to sell our house and downsize, but Karen fell in love with your property. She thought if she could force you out through HOA violations or make your life miserable enough, you might sell. The roses ruined her plan because they symbolized your resistance. That's why she became fixated on removing them." The pieces finally clicked into place. Karen's disproportionate rage, her escalating tactics, her inability to let go. She hadn't wanted to jog on my path. She had wanted to own it. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Larry looked tired, but somehow lighter, as if unburdened. "Because secrets like this destroy communities, and because I've filed for divorce. I'm done enabling her behavior." The news of Larry's divorce filing, combined with his whistleblowing about the falsified documents, spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen, now staying permanently at her sister's house, faced not just legal consequences but complete social ostracism. Her lawsuit against me was withdrawn by her attorney, who cited newly discovered evidence making the claim untenable. In a final attempt to save face, Karen called a press conference to announce she was dropping all claims for the good of the community. But her performance was undermined when reporters, now skeptical of her credibility, asked pointed questions about the falsified medical records. She stormed off mid-interview, unwittingly creating a viral moment that perfectly captured her fall from power. With Karen's deception fully exposed and legal consequences pending, the neighborhood could finally begin healing from the wounds her campaign had inflicted. And my roses, once a battleground, became a symbol of resilience against bullying and abuse of power. The most profound change, however, was in the community itself. Neighbors who had been intimidated into silence for years began to speak freely again. Those who had avoided HOA meetings for fear of Karen's retribution started attending and contributing ideas. What had begun as a simple boundary dispute had exposed the toxic leadership corroding our community from within and created the opportunity for something healthier to grow in its place. With the lawsuit behind me and Karen's reputation in tatters, I could have simply enjoyed my victory and moved on. But the experience had illuminated a broader issue in our community: the vulnerability of homeowners to HOA overreach and the power dynamics that allowed someone like Karen to terrorize an entire neighborhood for years. Martha had been doing an admirable job as interim president, but the HOA itself remained structurally unchanged. The same regulations that Karen had weaponized were still in place, waiting for the next power-hungry individual to exploit them. "You should run for the board," John suggested as we shared drinks on his patio one evening. The late summer air was perfumed with the scent of my roses, now in magnificent full bloom. Me? I've always avoided HOA politics. Exactly why you'd be good at it. You understand how the rules can be abused. Martha joined our conversation, having been invited for dinner. John's right, the next election is in 2 months, and we need level-headed people who won't repeat Karen's mistakes. I considered their suggestion. What changes could I actually make? The covenant is practically set in stone. Martha smiled. Not entirely. With enough board support, we could amend the most problematic regulations, create better checks and balances, more transparency, clearer appeals processes. A kinder, gentler HOA, I joked. A fairer one, John corrected, one that protects property values without trampling on homeowners' dignity. That conversation planted a seed. Over the next few weeks, I began drafting ideas for HOA reform, consulting with both John and Martha about feasible changes. I spoke with other neighbors who had suffered under Karen's regime, collecting their stories and suggestions. When the election nomination period opened, I submitted my name for consideration. To my surprise, so did Larry Wilkins. Karen had finally moved in with her sister permanently, but Larry had decided to stay in the neighborhood. His nomination statement mentioned healing community divisions and restoring neighborly trust. Some residents were skeptical, viewing him as Karen's puppet even in her absence. But in private conversations, Larry seemed genuinely interested in making amends. I enabled her behavior for years, he admitted when we ran into each other at the local coffee shop. Standing by while she bullied people, too weak to oppose her even when I knew she was wrong. I can't undo that, but I can try to be part of the solution now. His sincerity was compelling. Rather than seeing him as competition, I suggested collaboration. We could both serve on the board, bringing different perspectives. Larry looked surprised by the olive branch. You'd be willing to work with me? After everything? The past is past, I said. The neighborhood needs healing more than it needs grudges. As the election approached, the narrative shifted from Karen's victim versus Karen's husband to a joint reform platform. Larry and I, along with 3 other like-minded candidates, presented a unified vision for HOA governance based on fairness, transparency, and community input. The election results were decisive. All 5 reform candidates won board positions, with Martha re-elected as president. At our first official meeting, we passed a series of amendments to the HOA regulations, a new appeals process for violation notices requiring photographic evidence for all alleged violations, limits on fine amounts, and mandatory mediation before legal action. Perhaps most significantly, we established a community enhancement fund, using a portion of HOA dues previously allocated to enforcement. The fund would provide matching grants for homeowners undertaking beautification projects, turning the HOA from a punitive entity into a supportive one. Karen's roses had inadvertently planted the seeds for community transformation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Larry. She always said she wanted a beautiful neighborhood, he remarked at the board meeting where we approved the first round of enhancement grants. She just couldn't see that cooperation works better than coercion. Our reforms gained attention beyond our own community. The local newspaper ran a feature on our HOA revolution, and neighboring associations began inquiring about our new model. I found myself speaking at community meetings across the county, sharing our experience of transforming an oppressive system into a collaborative one. When spring arrived, bringing a new cycle of blooms to my now famous rose barrier, the neighborhood organized its first annual garden tour. 15 homeowners, including Larry with his newly installed perennial garden, opened their yards to visitors. My property was designated as the tour's centerpiece, with educational signage explaining both the rose varieties and the story behind their planting. From boundary dispute to community pride, read the main placard. How protective thorns became a symbol of neighborhood transformation. During the tour, I overheard a visitor asking Martha about the rose's origin. "Oh, that's quite a story," she chuckled. Those roses were originally planted because someone kept trespassing through his garden." "How rude!" the visitor exclaimed. "Who would do such a thing?" Martha smiled diplomatically. "Someone who no longer lives here. But in a way, we should thank her. Without her boundary violations, we might never have discovered how beautiful boundaries can be when properly respected." The garden tour raised substantial funds for the Community Enhancement Program, allowing us to expand grant opportunities for the coming year. Applications flooded in: patios, fountains, native plant installations, all projects that would enhance both individual properties and neighborhood aesthetics. One application particularly caught my attention: Larry's proposal for a community walking path that would wind through voluntarily contributed sections of participating backyards, creating a genuine community garden route. "Inspired by your stone path," he explained when I asked about it, "but done the right way, with permission, respect, and proper access points." The proposal passed unanimously, with my enthusiastic support. Construction began that summer, with neighbors contributing labor alongside professional landscapers. John designated a bird sanctuary section behind his property. Martha created a butterfly garden in hers, and I connected my famous rose-lined path to the network through a specially designed gate. By fall, the community path had become the neighborhood's defining feature, a physical manifestation of our new cooperative spirit. Property values rose accordingly, something the old HOA regime had attempted to force through punitive measures but had never actually achieved. The final chapter in the saga came unexpectedly, nearly 2 years after Karen's initial trespass through my garden. I received a real estate listing notification. Karen's sister's home was on the market, described as a perfect haven for those seeking tight community standards and rigorous property oversight. Reading between the lines, it appeared Karen had exported her controlling tendencies to a new neighborhood. I couldn't help but smile, imagining another homeowner with a stone path and a fondness for roses about to cross Karen's path. But that was someone else's story now. In our neighborhood, the thorny roses had fully matured into a breathtaking display that perfectly served their dual purpose, beautifying while protecting. Visitors often commented on their magnificent blooms, rarely realizing that their protective thorns had once been weapons in a neighborhood war. Now they were simply beautiful boundaries, respected by all who understood their purpose. 3 years after that fateful morning when Karen jogged uninvited through my garden, our neighborhood has become a case study in community transformation. The Walking Path Network now connects 27 properties, each contributing unique landscaping elements that create a horticultural journey through the neighborhood. Garden magazines have featured our story, and nearby communities have implemented similar models of cooperative beautification over punitive enforcement. The rose barrier remains, though its purpose has evolved. What began as a defensive measure now serves as the spectacular entrance to my section of the community path. I maintain them meticulously, both for their beauty and as a reminder that healthy boundaries and mutual respect form the foundation of true community. Larry has become an unexpected friend and valuable ally on the HOA board. Free from Karen's influence, he discovered a genuine talent for mediation and conflict resolution. When neighbors disagree about property issues, Larry often finds the compromise that satisfies all parties. "I had years of practice seeking middle ground," he jokes. Though back then the middle ground was always wherever Karen stood. We've heard that Karen now heads the HOA in her sister's neighborhood. Apparently, she's implemented a comprehensive violation documentation system that has neighbors installing security cameras, not to monitor strangers, but to protect themselves from her surprise compliance inspections. Some habits die hard, but her legacy in our community isn't what she intended. The Karen rules, as we sometimes call our amended HOA regulations, ensure that no single individual can ever again wield unchecked power over neighbors. Every violation notice requires secondary verification. All fines can be appealed to a rotating committee of homeowners, and legal action can only be pursued after mandatory mediation. The morning coffee ritual in my garden remains sacred, though now I occasionally have invited company. John still stops by regularly, and Martha joins when her schedule permits. Sometimes Larry brings his excellent homemade scones. On warm weekends, these informal coffee gatherings have expanded to include whoever happens to be walking the community path. We've installed a small seating area specifically for these impromptu social moments. Last month, during one such gathering, a new neighbor asked about the story behind the roses. The group fell silent, looking to me expectantly. They were planted to establish a boundary, I explained, watching bees navigate between the fragrant blooms, but they ended up connecting us instead. That's rather philosophical for garden planning, the newcomer observed. Martha laughed. You have no idea. These aren't just any roses. They're revolutionary roses. They overthrew a dictatorship. As the others shared increasingly dramatic versions of the Rose Rebellion, I smiled, remembering the genuine stress and anger of those days. Time had transformed a bitter dispute into neighborhood folklore, a cautionary tale with a happy ending. When everyone had gone, I walked my section of the stone path alone, reflecting on the journey. The path itself was unchanged, the same carefully selected stones I had installed years ago, but its meaning had transformed entirely. What Karen had tried to claim through entitlement, the community now shared through invitation and respect. The final irony came in the mail last week, a Community Achievement Award from the County Board of Supervisors, recognizing our neighborhood's innovative approach to enhancement-based governance. The award cited our rose-connected walking path as a physical manifestation of community cooperation and shared beautification goals. Attached to the official letter was a handwritten note from the county commissioner. From what I understand, we have an overzealous jogger to thank for inspiring all this. Sometimes the best systems arise from broken ones. I framed the letter and hung it near my garden entrance, a testament to the unexpected ways that conflict can lead to growth. The roses bloom ever more vigorously each year, their roots deepening, their structural strength increasing. In that way, they mirror our community. What began as a thorny defense has matured into something both beautiful and resilient. This morning, I welcomed another group of HOA board members from a nearby development, eager to learn from our experience. As we walked the community path, one woman asked the question visitors always ask, but how did you get people to cooperate? HOAs are usually so contentious. I pointed to my rose barrier, now softened by years of growth into a magnificent flowering archway. We learned to appreciate good boundaries, I explained, strong ones clearly defined, mutually respected. When everyone knows where the lines are, it's easier to find ways to connect across them. The visitors nodded thoughtfully, taking notes and photos. As they continued down the path, I remained on my stone walkway, coffee in hand, enjoying the morning quiet. In the distance, I could see John putting out fresh seed in his bird sanctuary. Martha was tending her butterfly garden. Larry waved from his patio where he was setting up for the afternoon board meeting. And somewhere beyond our transformed neighborhood, I imagined Karen distributing violation notices, never understanding that her greatest power play had ultimately become her greatest defeat and our community's unexpected salvation. If you've ever dealt with unreasonable neighbors or oppressive HOAs, I hope our story offers both vindication and inspiration. Sometimes standing your ground, especially when you do it within the rules, can transform not just your own situation but an entire community. The right boundaries, it turns out, don't divide us. They create the safe space where true connection can flourish. Has an unreasonable neighbor ever pushed you to take creative action? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of justice served with a side of unexpected community transformation.